Good morning, and welcome to the First Unitarian Church, and good morning. How are you all? Did you enjoy that jazzy introduction? Yeah. You know, that's one of the real great parts about this church, is that you get a chance to just listen to some wonderful music. Now, here's the first question. Is that David Owens at the piano? No. That is Merrill Smith, who is taking over for David for this morning. And so we get a variety of musicians who are playing. And the name of that piece was the jazzed-up version of May There Be Peace on Earth. How many think that's a pretty good title? May There Be Peace on Earth. Yeah. Is there peace on earth right now? No. That's kind of sad, isn't it? Yeah, it's troublesome. Yeah, right. It depends on where you are. One of the things that seems to work against having peace on earth is something that we're going to be talking about with the grown-ups when you're over in your Sunday school class, and that has to do with race. And race is dealing with people of different skin colors. Are you aware of people with different skin colors? Yeah, okay. What about in your classrooms? Are there other kids with different skin colors in your class? Okay. Does that seem to be a problem? No. Why is it a problem for grown-ups? They're strange. Yeah, they are strange. Do you think you could teach the grown-ups a few things about race? And help them to become what? Help them... What do they need to do? Liam? Understand people's differences, yeah. How else can we help those grown-ups? Yeah. Get to the point where it doesn't matter what their skin color is. Yeah, exactly, yeah. Wonderful. Don't judge by people's actions or how they look. You know, I think you guys should deliver the sermon today. You have a lot of wisdom, and I thank you for that. And the only hope that I have is that you keep those views, those ideas with you as you grow up. Keep those very important, and it sounds so simple, doesn't it? But it's not. Keep those basic ideas with you as you grow up. And you know, we may find ourselves in a better world because of you. Can we turn our hymn books, please, to number 210? Reprise. I'd like to do something a little different this morning when it comes to our time of reflection and prayer, meditation. I want to read two poems by Langston Hughes. They're not widely known. The first one might be. I think they're very powerful and gives us a chance to kind of focus on the wider subject that we will be addressing this morning. So imagine that this first poem that I'm going to read to you was written about 55 years ago. And if you can put yourself back then, I know many here were not even close to being born, but just from what you've read in your history books, kind of go back to that year, roughly, let's call it 1960. And just imagine having a black skin, thinking about the future, what life might be like, good heavens, certainly by the 21st century. So this first poem called I Too Sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. The second poem, called The Instructor, and it's quite revealing. The instructor said, "Go home and write a page tonight, and let that page come out of you. Then it will be true." I wonder if it's that simple. I am 22, colored, born in Winston-Salem. I went to school there, then Durham, then here to this college on the hill above Harlem. I'm the only colored student in my class. The steps from the hill lead down into Harlem through a park, then I cross St. Nicholas Avenue, 8th Avenue, 7th, and I come to the Y, the Harlem Branch Y, where I take the elevator up to my room, sit down, and write this page. It's not easy to know what is true for you or me at 22, my age. But I guess I'm what I feel and see and hear. Harlem, I hear you. Hear you. Hear me. We too. You, me, talk on this page. I hear New York too. Me. Who? Well, I like to eat, sleep, drink, and be in love. I like to work, read, learn, and understand life. I like a pipe for a Christmas present or records. Bessie, Bop, or Bach. I guess being colored doesn't make me not like the same things other folks like who are other races. So will my page be colored? Will that page be colored that I write? Being me, it'll not be white, but it will be a part of you, instructor. You are white, yet part of me as I am part of you. That's American. Sometimes, perhaps, you don't want to be a part of me, nor do I often want to be a part of you, but we are. That's true. As I learn from you, I guess you learn from me, although you're older and white,
and somewhat more free. This is my page for English B. Merrill, that was beautiful. Thank you so much. Our reading this morning is taken from the book Waking Up White by Debbie Irving. It is disarmingly honest and simple. And sometimes, in order to really get to the nub of an issue, being honest and frank and simple is the best path of getting there. Here's what she has to say. Not so long ago, if someone had called me a racist, I would have kicked and screamed in protest. But I'm a good person, I would have insisted. I don't see color. I don't have a racist bone in my body. I would have felt insulted and misunderstood and stomped off to lick my wounds. Now that's because I thought being a racist meant not liking people of color or being a name-calling bigot. For years, I struggled silently to understand race and racism. I had no way to make sense of debates in the media about whether the white guy was being a racist or the black guy was playing the race card. I wanted close friends of color, but kept ending up with white people as my closest friends. When I was with a person of color, I felt an inexplicable tension and a fear that I might say, of what I might say or do, something offensive or embarrassing. When white people made blatant racist jokes or remarks, I felt upset, but had no idea what to do or say. I didn't understand why, if laws supporting slavery, segregation, and discrimination had been abolished, lifestyles still looked so different across color lines. Most confusing were unwanted racist thoughts that made me feel like a jerk. I felt too embarrassed to admit any of this, which prevented me from going in search of answers. It turns out, stumbling block number one was that I didn't think I had a race, so I never thought to look within myself for answers. The way I understood it, race was for other people. Brown, black-skinned people. I mean, don't get me wrong, if you put a census form in my hand, I would know to check white or Caucasian. It's more that I thought all those other categories, like Asian, African American, American Indian, Latino, were the real races. I thought white was the raceless race, just plain, normal, the one against which all others are measured. What I learned is that thinking of myself raceless allowed for a distorted frame of reference built on faulty beliefs. For instance, I used to believe race is all about biological differences. I can help people of color by teaching them to be more like me. Racism is about bigots who make snarky comments and commit intentionally cruel acts against people of color. Culture and ethnicity are only for people of other races and from other countries. If the cause of racial inequity were understood, it would be solved by now. Well, if these beliefs sound familiar to you, you're not alone. I've met hundreds of white people across America who share not only these beliefs, but the same feelings of race-related confusion and anxiety that I experienced. This widespread phenomenon of white people wanting to guard themselves against appearing stupid, racist, or radical has resulted in an epidemic of silence from the people who care deeply about justice and love for their fellow human beings. I believe most white people would take a stand against racism if only they knew how, or even imagined that they had a role. In this small world of ours, Merrill clued me in that he is a former, I guess it never ends, fraternity brother of Rocky Anderson. And also the other piece was?
The other fellow I know is Pat Shea.
Pat Shea. Okay.
We went to high school together.
You went to high school with Pat Shea. Wow.
He's older, but he's better looking.
Right. There's a chance once again to welcome everyone here, and want to just take a moment to do a special hello and welcome to those who are here for the very first time. We all know how difficult that might be, or frightening, or whatever, just to walk into a church for the first time, all these new faces. And so we really want to make an effort to reach out to you and make you comfortable in this new surrounding. And one of the ways that you can help us do that is if you would please be so kind to stand so we can tag you and kind of have a cup of coffee with you at the coffee hour. So if anyone is new here for the first time, please stand up so we can say welcome. And all right, well, thank you so much. And we're doing something brand new, and that is our Minister for Congregational Life will be having on the first Sunday of every month kind of a meet and greet for people who are not necessarily here for the very first time, but who are relatively new and would like to meet some other newcomers and who might have some questions about Unitarian Universalism or this church in particular. And he should be down. He's right now teaching our high school population. He should be down here, and how do we describe him? I'll just hang around, and I'll make sure Matthew finds you, and then you'll go up to what is called the parlor, and we'll have the meet and greet. Bob, what are you signaling? Oh, Matthew's here. Will you show yourself? It's great to. Okay, it's great to see you. But what have you done with the high school kids? Please be sure to. Oh, you got to have faith, you know. Please be sure to take a look at all the important announcements in your order of service. And in order to get a cup of coffee, we will quiz you to make sure that you know exactly what's going on. In the meantime, the offering will gratefully be received, and a chance to bid one another a good morning and a welcome to this church. Moses never made it to the promised land. He got right to the border. But after leading the Israelites through the wilderness for 40 years, God told him, sorry, you're not going to make it to the finish line. And Moses went up Mount Nebo, where God showed him the land of milk and honey, the land that he promised to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Moses returned from Mount Nebo to the town of Moab, where he died. Kind of sounds like a local story, doesn't it? It was now up to Joshua to lead the Israelites in their conquest of Canaan. It would not be easy, so God gave these words to Joshua: be strong and of good courage. 3 weeks ago, Cornell Brooks, president of the National NAACP, invoked these same words: be strong and of good courage. He was addressing a crowd on the lawn just north of the Capitol. People gathered who had just completed America's journey for justice, a 46-day, 1,000-mile march from Selma, Alabama, through Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and ending up at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. The march was in support of restoring the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Seems like we're going backwards, doesn't it, in time? The U.S. Supreme Court's decision in 2013 effectively allowed certain jurisdictions with histories of voting discrimination to overhaul their laws without federal oversight. The rationale at that time was that so much has changed in the past 50 years, and they concluded that racism was now an issue of the past. No longer having to submit to federal oversight, these states took their newfound freedom and placed even greater restrictions on voters that would disproportionately affect minorities. Cornell Brooks made a point of telling the weary marchers on the lawn outside the Capitol that voting rights had never been handed down from up high. There is something for which Americans have had to fight and die. The marchers represented a new wave of soldiers in the struggle for the promised land. And so Brooks said to them, "Be strong and of good courage." Since biblical times, justice always slanted towards the powerful. And this power was abused as it was wielded to oppress further those who had so little. Any sense of justice remained so far out of reach. Old Testament prophets admonished the powerful to act otherwise. The New Testament speaks of our responsibilities to those who require measures of support. Now, as a religious nation, it's surprising how poorly we follow the mandates so clearly prescribed in our sacred scriptures. The abuse of power has rendered a tragic history in America. We get a glimpse of the pain and the sorrow and the persecution from Billie Holiday's song, written in 1939, "Strange Fruit." Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves, blood on the root, black bodies swinging in the breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth. Scents of magnolias, sweet and fresh, then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the winds to suck, for the sun to rot, for the trees to drop. Here is a strange and bitter crop. The last recorded lynching of a black man in this country was 1968. In 1998, James Byrd of Jasper, Texas, died as he was hauled by 3 white men behind their pickup truck with a chain. The struggle to get to the promised land continues. Be strong and of good courage. In the wake of George Zimmerman's acquittal in the shooting death of Trayvon Martin, July 2013, a new movement began with a hashtag on Twitter, Black Lives Matter. What do those 3 words mean? What do they mean to you? Black Lives Matter. Are these words a plaintive cry of despair? Are these words intended to threaten the white power structures? Are these words a plea for help Or are they an affirmation that all life is sacred, we are all children of God, and therefore black lives matter also? The Black Lives Movement began 27 months ago, but has grown significantly with new impetus following the shooting death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And since Michael Brown, the police killings of unarmed African Americans across our whole nation has become a frightening and all too common occurrence. Well, maybe voting rights do not come from on high, but it is a sad day in a country when a minority population has to fight and struggle to end state-sanctioned violence against them. And it's a sad day in a country when African Americans must endure acts of racial terror, like the one that took 9 lives at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Black Lives Matter is a movement telling our nation that the destruction of black lives occur only because of the color of their skin. They're not asserting that black lives are any more precious than white lives. They merely wish to point out the obvious facts that have historically plagued our nation, namely that the lives of black citizens in this country have never really mattered and have been systematically discounted and destroyed. Ferguson, Baltimore, Staten Island, North Charleston represent new iterations of racism that time has not dissolved. 2 years leading up to the riots in Watts, 65 African Americans were killed by the LAPD, including 27 of them who were shot in the back. Did black lives matter then? That was 1965 when Watts went up in smoke. The following year, 1966, the Black Panthers began to organize. That's 50 years ago, when black citizens thought that it was about time that the police in their communities be properly monitored. Now, the technology of attaching video cams to police uniforms was unthinkable 50 years ago, of course. So the Panthers decided to follow and monitor police officers themselves with unconcealed weapons. Be strong and of good courage. The Black Panthers had a newspaper that reached 150,000 people. The Black Panthers, as some of you might recall, provided free breakfast to the children trapped in the ghetto, gave them clothing, and even provided a modicum of health care for the kids and their families. In the second edition of the newspaper, they laid out a 10-point plan. Now remember, this is 50 years ago. This was their plan, half a century ago. Full employment, decent housing, historically conscious education, the end of black imprisonment, and the end of subjugation to police brutality. Their 10-point plan said to me, back then, 50 years ago, it said to me, Black lives matter. But the Panthers imploded in violent confrontation with the police, and the FBI sought out and assassinated Black Panther leaders. When the horrendous death of Emmett Till galvanized the civil rights movement in 1955, it was all about Black Lives Matter. When W.E.B. Du Bois founded the NAACP in 1909, the intent back then was to proclaim Black Lives Matter. The NAACP was founded at a time when leading scientists in our nation were publishing books and articles on eugenics and determining what forms of life shall be preserved. The NAACP was founded at a time when the great conservationist Madison Grant, founder of the Bronx Zoo and very close friend of Teddy Roosevelt, wrote of white supremacism and warned everybody in his book of the decline of the Nordic people. Now, this is when the NAACP was organized in an effort to say, whoa, Black Lives Matter. Nat Turner led a slave rebellion, 1831. Justice was not simply handed down from on high. It's something you have to fight for and die. And that's been the struggle and the protests and the marches throughout our history. But the words that gave meaning to this struggle were not articulated with this kind of precision as it was 27 months ago. Those three simple words, Black Lives Matter. In an honest appraisal of American culture, as painful as it is for white liberals to admit, white supremacy represents the platform upon which our nation was built, and we could follow the threads back to our founding fathers. Now, white supremacy does not automatically suggest violence or evil intent, but it does foster a climate of inequality among races, which accounts for the persistent struggle, we still feel today, that struggle to gain entry into a promised land with a just society. Our Unitarian history is part of the tapestry that has established a toxic white supremacy. We teach our children, even to this day, how Unitarians, as these were all abolitionists, the good guys. Well, we were the good guys back in the early part of the 19th century, the good guys who brought an ounce of respect to black citizens during slavery. Not really accurate. Even our good guys, like Theodore Parker, who along with Thomas Wentworth Higginson stormed the federal courthouse to rescue fugitive slaves and placed them on the Underground Railroad back to Canada. This same Theodore Parker, who believed, slavery was wrong, still refused to believe that blacks and whites were equal? No. This same Theodore Parker also led a campaign to keep 3 black men out of Harvard Medical School. Before Parker, there was William Ellery Channing, who gave shape and form to the founding of American Unitarianism in 1825. His fine New England family owned slaves, while his Uncle George made his fortune operating a distillery that sold rum to slave traders. As minister, William Ellery Channing maintained a neutral position on slavery, as though that were really possible. In his pamphlet called Slavery, he condemned both slave owners and abolitionists. He sought change through what he called moral suasion. Okay? But that was not enough for his Unitarian congregation, who prevented Channing from performing a memorial service for his friend, Charles Follen, who was an abolitionist, its congregation, prevented Channing from holding that service in their church. Our beloved Henry David Thoreau delivered a speech in 1854 called Slavery in Massachusetts. Yeah, on one hand, he addressed the indignity of slavery, but like virtually all good Unitarians and liberals at that time, an anti-slavery position never precluded a belief in white supremacy. When Thoreau spoke and wrote about American nature and American culture, he viewed himself as the spokesman for the culture of a white nation. In his essay entitled Walking, he wrote that American greatness arose, and I quote, as the farmer displaces the Indian, even before he redeems the meadow and makes himself stronger and in some respects more natural. His point being that American nature was a way for a white person to become symbolically native to the continent. We may want to excuse our white liberal forebears as having this unconscious racism. In those days, it was different to assume white supremacy or something like that. But we still need to admit that the culture of our nation, deliberate or unintentional, established an ethos of white supremacy that has been deeply ingrained into the consciousness of this country and which has made justice something for which black citizens must fight for and struggle and die for today. It was supposed to be different today. From the time when James Baldwin wrote The Fire Next Time in 1963, a letter to his 14-year-old nephew. As Michelle Alexander recently wrote, Baldwin is trying to help his nephew make sense of blatant racial injustice and come to grips with his place in a world that refuses to guarantee for him the freedoms that so many others take for granted. In writing to his nephew, Baldwin does not deny the pain and the horror of American notions of justice. In fact, far from it. But he repeatedly emphasizes the young man's own power and potential and urges him to believe that revolutionary change is possible against all odds, because as black people, we continue to defy the odds and defeat the expectations of those who seek to control and exploit us. So imagine 50 years ago, someone like James Baldwin laying this on a 14-year-old black kid. You got to keep up with the revolution. I know it's horrible. It's up to you to push forward. Things will be different. You got to keep it up. I can hear him saying to his nephew, be strong and of good courage. It's a fight, but we will prevail. And this optimism reflects the feeling in a Langston Hughes poem written about the same time, in which he urges his son to never stop fighting and to have courage. And that poem goes like this. This is to his son. Well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't no crystal stair. It had tacks in it, and splinters, and boards torn up, and places with no carpet on the floor, bare. But all the time, I's been a-climbing and reaching landings and turning corners, and sometimes going in the dark where there ain't been no light. So, boy, don't you turn back. Don't you sit down on the steps because you find it kind of hard. You don't fall now, for I's still going, honey. I's still climbing, and life for me ain't been no crystal stair. But today, 50 years later, since the poem by Langston Hughes, and of course the letter by Baldwin, Ta-Nehisi Coates today writes a letter to his 15-year-old son in book form called Between the World and Me. It comes at a moment in our history when we struggle to make sense of how frequently black lives are destroyed through incessant police violence and mass incarceration. Now, this letter that Coates writes to his son is not charged with the admonishment to awaken to his own power, to keep on fighting and struggling, don't turn back. Instead, Ta-Nehisi Coates emphasizes the permanence of racial injustice. If you believe you can change it, he tells his son, if you believe you can change this injustice, you're a fool. How different that is. What a contrast from 50 years ago. You think you could change it? You're a fool. He advises his son not to believe in the American dream, because the dream is lived in the suburbs. And in the suburbs you find unworried boys and pies and pot roasts, white fences and green lawns. They will not relinquish their status or privilege or the tactics they secured for their advantage. Coates recounts the violence that lay at the center of his own life growing up in Baltimore. Fear ruled everything around me, he wrote, and I knew, as all black people do, that this fear was connected to the dream out there. What an insidious dream. And yet, the presidential candidates of today still refer to it, don't they? They refuse to acknowledge that this dream of prosperity, open ostensibly to everyone who is willing to try, is not only deceptive, but actually crushes the very modest dreams that black parents have for their children, like good health and quality education. Black Lives Matter speaks directly not only to the police who remind black citizens of their powerlessness. Black Lives Matter speaks pointedly to all of us who are part of the dream. All of us, part of the dream, who prosper, whose children flourish, and all of us who quietly tend our little gardens while failing to realize how our comfortable lives relate directly to the destruction of black lives. As Frederick Douglass observed long ago, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and never will. We, the dreamers, hold all the power. Now, we don't see it clearly from where we live or where we shop or how we do business. Coates wrote, "The dreamers are the ones who continue to believe the lie at black people's expense." Baldwin tells his nephew, as Langston Hughes' black father tells his son, reiterated 50 years later by Cornell Brooks, they're all saying, keep up the fight and struggle. Be strong and of good courage. And Baldwin actually goes so far as to advise his nephew of the responsibility he holds, and I quote from Baldwin, to make America what it must become. He's telling this 14-year-old black nephew, you make America what it must become. And Ta-Nehisi Coates also wants his son to struggle. Struggle for the memory of his ancestors, struggle for wisdom, but don't pin your struggle on the conversion of the dreamers. There we go again, the dreamers. That's us. And I know we probably take some offense at that, because it's hard to recognize our part in perpetuating the history of racism in this country. So better to help us focus, to shake us from this indifference, this ignorance, to concede the power we pretend that we don't even have. A good starting point would be to hear very clearly the message deeply rooted in Black Lives Matter. Now, we can join the fight and the struggle for justice. We really can. We can by addressing, by becoming alert to, by feeling and knowing our own racism and the racism intrinsic to our institutions. Be strong and of good courage. So be it. Can we conclude our service turning our hymn books, please, to number 104. Please be seated for a second, because before we get to the closing words, I just want to read you a brief note People say that, oh, Unitarian ministers just preach to the choir, but I want to tell you that's not always the case. After the 9 o'clock service, someone handed to our welcoming table a note which said, "Please pay attention. Black Lives Matter is a racist, hate-inciting front for the new Black Panthers." Disavowing racism means disavowing all racism. So we still have a ways to go, us people of the dream. But the closing words are very helpful. They come from a woman I know most of us really love, and that's Elizabeth Warren. She spoke last Sunday on the subject, and here's just a smidgen of what she had to say. None of us can ignore what is happening in this country. Not when our black friends, black families, black neighbors literally fear dying in the streets. This is the reality all of us must confront, as uncomfortable and ugly as that reality may be. It comes to us once again to affirm that Black lives matter, that Black citizens matter, and that Black families matter. Amen.